All right. Interest groups operate at all levels of government and they use a variety of strategies to steer policies in ways that benefit their interests. Now, sometimes they attempt to influence policymakers, whether Congress or the executive branch. They do it directly. But other times they try to exert indirect influence on policymakers by shaping public opinion. So the extent and nature of the group's activities depend on their goals. Of course, it depends on their income, their resources. This lesson here, this lecture, will show how interest groups influence. Okay, so here you can see a couple of interest groups that are environmental interest groups like Greenpeace, the Natural Resource Defense Council, the Sierra Club, and the Wilderness Society. Now the Sierra Club has 1.3 million members. They care about the wilderness, pollution, and so what do they do? How do they get influence? Well, grassroots action. They try to get people interested. They have lawyers because obviously they use litigation, and they have some PR people, so they kind of get in the news. Now you'll notice the Natural Resource Defense Council, they got 1.2 million, and they go out and lobby, something we're going to be really focusing on. That costs a lot of money. But they have a lot of members, and therefore they probably have a lot of dues. They could afford it. Something like Greenpeace, which is the smallest membership, they do not do lobbying, as you can see. Very expensive. So let's focus on lobbyists. So of the direct techniques, lobbying is the greatest one. Today, lobbying refers to all of the attempts by organizations or by individuals to influence the passage or to defeat or to help draft legislation or to influence how the executive branch executes that legislation. The term, by the way, lobbying arose because traditionally these individuals and groups interested in influencing government policy would gather in the foyer or the lobby of the legislative, of the Congress and the hotels in which they lived. Anyway, a lobbyist is an individual who handles a particular interest group's lobbying efforts. Most of the larger interest groups have lobbyists in DC or they hire lobbyist firms. These lobbyists often include actually former members of Congress or former employees of executive bureaucracies who are experienced in the methods of political influence and who know people. Many lobbyists also work at state and local levels. In fact, lobbying at the state level has increased in recent years as states have begun to play a more significant role in policy makers. Now you can see this cartoon, I guess this cartoonist is trying to say that lobbyists have a lot of influence with Congress. To really understand more about lobbyists and their impact on Congress, you really need to watch this segment. It's on our blog about 60 Minutes and the Medicare bill. It is really incredible and how the pharmaceutical companies really lobbied and pushed for legislation that benefited their constituents. It's all fair, right? But it's really interesting, so make sure you watch that. So you have this chart that really shows you the techniques of lobbyists, whether they testify at hearings, they contact government officials directly, help draft legislation, etc. So in any case, lobbying is one of the most widely used and effective ways to influence legislation. For example, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, they have lobbyists too, guys, and they have a lot of success at both the state and federal levels. The NRA has successfully blocked most proposed gun control laws in the past 10, 15 years, even when a majority of Americans have favored such laws. An NRA brochure actually describes its lobbying operation as the quote-unquote the strongest, most formidable grassroots lobby in the nation. Nevertheless, the NRA has occasionally been defeated in its lobbying efforts by interest groups that support gun regulation, just like Madison said. You get different factions. There you can see how they influence. But please pay attention that lobbying can be directed at the legislative branch of government, but also administrative agencies, heck, even the courts. For example, pharmaceutical companies may lobby the Food and Drug Administration to speed up the process or approve new prescription drugs. They can directly lobby to exchange international policies with the president. For instance, after political changes had opened up Eastern Europe to business in the late 1980s and 1990s, intense lobbying by Western business groups helped persuade, the American administration and other industrial powers to reduce controls on the sale of high-tech products like personal computers to Eastern European countries. So that's what we mean by not just Congress, okay? Now, lobbyists get a bad rap. A lot of people are like, oh, members of Congress are in bed with lobbyists. Well, for some, actually, it's true. Some interest groups also influence congressmen or congresswomen by hiring their spouses. According to the 2006 budget, there were 30 instances where spouse lobbyists sought millions of dollars from their own husbands' committees, if you can believe it. That's why reformers are really upset with what they call this cozy relationship between Congress or the executive branch with K Street. K Street is where most lobbyist firms are. As you can see, the growth of the industry is incredible from this chart. In 2000, there were 16,000 registered lobbyists. Now there's 32,000. I mean, don't forget, there's only 435 members of Congress, guys. And there's 32,000 registered lobbyists in 2005. Wow. And by the way, lobbyists love both parties. They don't mind. Whoever's in control is what they really want to do. When the Republicans were in control, most lobbyists were geared to the Republicans. And when Democrats took over in 2006, they were geared now to the Democrats. Really, whoever's in charge. One of the biggest problems that people see is how lobbyists have this thing called the revolving door, that many members of Congress or their staff, members of the executive branch, for example, the Obama administration, their chief budget officer just resigned and now works for Citibank, and he's going to be a lobbyist there. People complain that there's just way too cozy because of this revolving door from government to interest groups. I mean, this graph shows how many members from the judiciary, 104 members of the Judiciary Committee and their staff members are now working as lobbyists, 94 from the finance. So you can see it really is a problem. So lobbyists spend hundreds of millions of dollars. The pharmaceutical company in 10 years spent over $1 billion to get what they need. And that is through hiring lawyers. Sometimes they provide election support. Interest groups become directly involved in the election process by creating PACs and supporting politicians, like unions do that for the Democrats, and Chamber of Commerce might be doing that for Republicans. Let's see, there were about 1,000 PACs in the 1970s. By 2007, 2008, there are thousands of them, and they exceed over $400 million in donations. Many of these are from lobbyists and interest groups. And sometimes if you don't pay, well, look what happens. Microsoft was one of those companies that didn't do a lot of lobbying, and what do you know? It gets caught by the Justice Department as a monopoly. It's going to get in trouble. Well, suddenly they quadruple their lobbying fees, and voila! Next thing you know, they're kind of exempt from some of the more strict rulings by the Justice Department, which was going to split up their business. So again, lobbying does make an impact in Washington. Very recently, there's this scandal, quote-unquote scandal, with Soliandra, which is a solar company, that they were the ones who really lobbied hard to get money from the federal government. I mean, $500 million. And now there's this huge scandal. I mean, was it something that the Obama administration gave them because they were lobbyists? And that's okay. But was it because they also donated money to the political party? Well, that would be a scandal. We'll find out what happens in the next couple of weeks when Congress investigates. Jon Stewart has his take, and we'll look at that in our next part of our unit when we do the media. Make sure in your reading you look at how lobbyists have been regulated since the 1990s. Obviously, disclosure is important, no longer tax breaks, the limiting of gifts and free meals, especially since the Abramoff scandal. Here's a cartoon, pause it and examine it. The Abramoff scandal was in 2008, Abramoff was found guilty of trading in gifts and meals. I mean, he spent millions of dollars on sporting events. The corruption investigation led to the Bush White House, where officials were arrested. Congressmen were arrested, Bob Ney, for example. 9 other lobbyists, congressional aides. It was a pretty bad scandal. However, please watch the 60 Minutes from last week where he talks how the problem's still there. It's called the Jack Abramoff Lobbyist Playbook. It's on our blog. It's fascinating. So, what else do interest groups do? They could form think tanks, like the Cato Institute for Libertarians, the Heritage Institute for conservative issues, the Brookings Institute for liberal issues. Basically, these are people who have a certain ideology. They get together, they write ideas and papers, and hopefully when their party gets in control, they will have legislation passed by that, by what their research indicates. For many interest groups who can't afford to lobby, what they do is use the courts. For example, the NAACP, they might sue on behalf of a client, like in the Brown versus Board of Education case. They can try to get the courts to get on their side, not the federal government, the Congress or the president. Now, they can't lobby. That would be unethical, or donate money, but they can sue. Perhaps they can pay for a lawsuit. So the ACLU can pay for a student who is being sued, who is suing his school district for religious reasons, or they can file an amicus brief. That's really important. So like an interest group has an interest in, let's say, for example, the Chamber of Commerce is watching Walmart get sued, and maybe they'll file a brief. Okay, interest groups can also kind of avoid certain branches and go right to the people to directly connect with voters or their interest group to try to mobilize public opinion. So the Got Milk ads, right? Or the Other White Meat. Those are interest group advertisements paid by the, Dairy Farmers of America, or the pork raisers, I guess, of America. But ads are expensive. So sometimes they try to do grassroots movements. Like, for example, although there was no interest group that sparked the Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Parties, but that's what we mean by a grassroots movement. You gotta love this, though. Some interest groups look for instant grassroots, so something that we sometimes laugh at and call astroturf. But there are lobbyists like the Bonner and Associates who specialize on grassroots movements. They'll create it themselves. And the fourth way they directly, they influence policy is by, well, if you don't like the member of Congress, how about get your own through electoral politics? This is very expensive. But they use PACs to help friendly legislators or to slam legislators who are against them. So they might engage in campaign activism, like Club for Growth is an interest group of conservatives who don't like taxes. And they make members of Congress sign oaths that they will not raise taxes. Another thing they do is give report cards. Look at this, the ACU, the ACLU, ADA, the NRA, they actually give grades to members of Congress to let their members know not to vote for them or to vote for them. That's really powerful. The NRA has a very powerful grading system. The Christian Coalition used to in the 1980s and 90s. NARAL, the one all the way on the right, is a women's organization solely focused on abortion rights, and you can see they give Mitch McConnell a 0, but they give Dianne Feinstein a 100. So very interesting, very powerful. Emily's List, another one. In any case, that's how interest groups influence policy.